Freedom of the press is important. I don't think anyone without a bone saw in their hand will dispute that. And as a free speech advocate, I certainly don't either. After all, without the press, who's going to tell you all about how that thing you like is racist now? But amidst all of the screeching over the current thing and cries of literally 1984, it's easy to forget that with great freedom comes great responsibility. As you all know, I don't exactly have the best relationship with the media. Yes, they've spent several years lying about me, trying to destroy my reputation, and absolutely annihilating any chance I ever had at regular employment. But at least I'm still here to tell you all about what they did to me. Unfortunately, not everyone is so lucky. While journalists often indirectly put people in harm's way because media circuses can very easily get out of hand, today we're going to talk about a time where journalists really did get blood on their hands. A time where them getting the story mattered far more than actual human lives, which resulted in great tragedy. The Gladbeck hostage crisis. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. But before we get started, this video is brought to you by Raycon. With Raycon earbuds, you can greatly enhance your listening experience with incredible quality at half the price of other premium audio brands. The new everyday earbuds are better than ever with an improved rubber look and feel that is both sleek and stylish. They have been specifically modified through many design iterations to seamlessly fit the curvature of your ears, as well as including varying optimized gel tips for your comfort and security regardless of the shape of your ears. Previous customers have given over 50,000 5-star reviews online. I enjoy my Raycons because of the ease of use, the sound is great, and they are consistently reliable, which is handy for passing the time on the train to work every single day. Raycons are now more adaptable than ever, with a built-in mic that allows you to take a call at the push of a button, and it includes easy-to-use media controls. They are also compatible with both Siri and Alexa, and include 3 audio profiles for you to customize your listening experience. Enjoy your music and videos with high-quality bass and passive noise isolation for true immersion. Raycons are also resistant to sweat and water, so they can survive accidentally going through the washing machine or being dropped in a puddle. With the charging case, the Raycons offer up to 32 hours of battery life. So if you want to get some top tier earbuds while also supporting my channel, then click my link in the description box down below or go to buyraycon.com/Dankula to get 15% off of your Raycon purchase, or use the buy now pay later options for as low as $18 at checkout. Also, Raycon offers 2 years of product protection insurance for only a few bucks, and if you are dissatisfied, there is an easy and free returns guarantee. To understand how and why the hostage crisis went down in such an outrageous fashion, we need to look into the early lives of the hostage takers. Don't worry, they're German. The ringleaders of the media circus were a pair of petty criminals named Dieter Degowski and Hans-Jürgen Rosner. As per usual with our criminal mad lads, both men had very rough childhoods that were overseen by abusive and neglectful fathers that led directly to a life of crime. In Hans's case, his career began when his father forced him to go shoplifting with him, until Hans developed a bit of a taste for it himself. Now, shoplifting is a relatively petty crime, and Hans was just a child, so you would think he would have an easier time with the law should things go awry. But for Hans, the stakes were actually pretty high. According to Hans, when he finally got caught for the first time, he came home to brutal beatings from his father, while the cop that brought him home watched. Naturally, this and other such interactions with the police left Hans with a pretty clear, though some would argue healthy, bias against cops. It also led to Hans going on to realise that we live in a society. And he wasn't happy about that, which further fueled his angry anti-authority streak. However, there was one person in Hans's life that wasn't out to get him. His best friend, Dieter, who he met in special ed class of all places. Reportedly, Dieter had an IQ of 79, and he didn't start school until he was 7 years old. I can almost imagine how that class went. So the cow says moo, the sheep says ba, the pig says stop resisting. I'm sorry, that was awful. Dieter didn't just lag behind intellectually, but also physically, as he didn't learn how to walk properly and would drag one leg behind him and have somewhat of a bouncy gait. So it wasn't a case of an injury or a disability or anything. He was just that stupid that he literally didn't learn how to walk right. But he and Hans became close friends very quickly because Hans was pretty much the only person that didn't make fun of him. With this kind of start in life, it should not come as a surprise that Hans and Dieter practically filled the complete career criminal checklist. Daddy issues, check. Mental health problems, check. Substance abuse issues, well, just Dieter, but it still counts, check. But while only Dieter had the substance problem, both he and Hans had pretty long rap sheets, though they were mostly filled with fairly petty crimes that they'd been up to since an early age. And just to further emphasise the standard of criminal that we're dealing with here, Dieter didn't even learn how to read his rap sheet until he was in prison, where he shared a cell with Hans for 8 months in 1983. Hans's first conviction occurred when he was only 14 years old, and he was in and out of prison so often that he spent a total of 11 years inside, where he stabbed a cop on one occasion. Hans got these 11 years for a number of things like assault, shoplifting, and breaking and entering, before he eventually disappeared while on parole in 1986. Dieter, meanwhile, had managed to keep his nose relatively clean in the eyes of the law, though he largely spent his existence couch surfing and sleeping under bridges after getting drunk with the homeless. Obviously, this isn't a very good way to live, so Dieter eventually managed to get on welfare, which put a roof over his head and a steady supply of schnapps, beer, cigarettes, and sleeping pills into his system. Dieter really likes sleeping pills. So he still wasn't doing great, but at least he was staying out of trouble. For now. Hans, however, was not staying out of trouble, and he was on the tail end of a months-long crime spree when he realised that the cops' crosshairs were now on him, and it was only a matter of time before he got caught. So he decided that he had to get out of the game. But to do so, he would have to pull off one last big score. One that would allow him to make a clean break and start afresh somewhere else. However, his erratic, unreliable and downright sloppy behaviour over the past few months had alienated all of his other criminal friends, leaving only one potential partner in crime left, Dieter. Despite the fact that Hans hadn't really done anything major up until that point, and by all accounts wasn't really very good at crime, he felt like dipping his toes into something bigger. Though it'd be more apt to say that he was about to plunge out of his depth. According to Hans, his idea was to rob a supermarket, but Dieter had something else in mind. A Deutsche Bank in their hometown of Gladbeck. At 20 to 8 in the morning on the 16th of August 1988, Hans and Dieter put their heist plan into action. Since they weren't really smart enough to come up with anything better, they decided to keep it simple with a quick smash and grab operation. Just go in, loot the vault, and get out. They burst into the bank before opening time, they held up the employees at gunpoint, and got to work. However, a doctor that was on his way to work noticed what was going on inside the bank when he was passing by outside. So he ran to his nearby practice and called the cops. But unfortunately, the first thing that the cops did when they arrived would set the tone for the rest of this story. They immediately made their presence abundantly clear to Hans and Dieter by driving straight past the bank's massive windows. This obviously caused Hans and Dieter to panic, so they started to threaten the bank staff with their guns, they shut the curtains and blocked the windows with posters, and they started taking pot shots at the cops. By 8 AM, this robbery had very quickly become a hostage situation. While Hans and Dieter were making their preparations for the siege, it wasn't long before the cops were also dug in around the building, ready and waiting for the order to storm in, neutralise the threat, and save the hostages. Except the order never came, because the higher-ups deemed the situation too high risk, so instead the negotiators stepped up to gain as much information about the robbers as possible, while stalling for time until the hostage-takers realised that there was absolutely no way out of this situation and just decided to give themselves up. As if being trapped inside the bank wasn't bad enough, Hans and Dieter's plan had gone critically wrong in another way. The vault required 2 keys, and while they got 1 key off of the cashier, the manager had the second one. And the manager was running late that day, and he wasn't in the bank yet. So they had absolutely no way of getting the second key that they needed to grab the loot. The cops were just outside, and time was of the essence, so Hans and Dieter had to think fast. So they just asked the cops for the second key. As the negotiators began talking to them over the radio, Hans and Dieter demanded the second key to the vault, as well as a getaway car and 300,000 marks. As the day went on, the negotiators managed to figure out who Hans and Dieter were, which greatly boosted the cops' confidence because the cops knew these guys. They knew how stupid they were, and they knew that these 2 amateur morons were way out of their depth, and that rescuing the hostages would now be easy. But there were a couple of snags. The first was that the negotiations were not going well. The negotiators' tone wasn't assertive enough, so Hans and Dieter realised that they could just double down on their demands and not take any shit from them. But the other snag was much worse. The cops hadn't cut the phone lines to the bank, and the cashier inside had contacted the media and told them what was happening. So, gentlemen, I regret to inform you, the journalists are coming. The cashier did this in the hope that a large media presence would put public pressure on the cops to rescue him quicker. Though he forgot to consider the fact that journalists don't really care about human lives. So instead, the phone in the bank just kept ringing and ringing and ringing and ringing. All throughout the day, Hans and Dieter were absolutely inundated with calls from journalists all over Germany looking for a scoop for their radio and TV shows and newspaper headlines. Basically, the phone constantly ringing was stressing out the hostage takers. And if there is one thing you don't want to do, it's stress out people who have hostages. But journalists don't really care about such things. But the media interest had another unintended effect. All of this attention actually emboldened Hans and Dieter in a way that left the cops with no idea what to do, since going in for the hostages suddenly became a very dangerous idea once again. So, what did the cops do in response to this absolute shit show? At around 5:30, the cops finally caved and gave Hans and Dieter everything they wanted. The money and the key to the vault were delivered by a cop wearing nothing but swimming trunks. Obviously, I think this was to make sure he didn't have a gun on him. And this cop was met at the door by the bank's cashier, who had crawled over to him on all fours with a cord around his neck that was held by hands. Germans really will find any excuse to be kinky. After the vault was cleared of its 120,000 marks, Hans and Dieter took 2 hostages from the bank and set off in the getaway car that the police had so kindly provided for them. Though they did give them a shitty Audi to keep them from moving too fast. At almost 10 to 10 at night, they were gone. After almost 14 hours, the cops lost a hostage negotiation to a pair of literal low IQ special ed morons. And then it got worse. They lost the morons. Hans and Dieter managed to escape because instead of trying to get out of the city as fast as possible and running into any of the roadblocks that the cops had set up, they just drove aimlessly around. They frequently stopped for snacks and stocked up on sleeping pills and beer because German, and they carried out a few carjackings until they managed to Goldilocks themselves a BMW. They even picked up Hans's girlfriend, Marion Loblich, who for some reason decided to join them on this merry little road trip at around 1 a.m. The police were completely stumped. They were at a complete loss of how to handle these 2 idiots because them being really stupid actually put the police at a disadvantage. It meant they were completely unpredictable. The cops had no idea what the hell Hans and Dieter were doing because Hans and Dieter also had no idea what they were doing. The cops were frantically working to set up roadblocks and ambushes along every possible route that they expected Hans and Dieter to take, and then the 2 idiots would just randomly go somewhere else on a complete whim. So the big dramatic car chase that usually happens after a bank robbery was less of a cat and mouse pursuit and more a game of blind man's bluff. And as if that wasn't bad enough for the cops, the police chief himself stopped at a garage on his way back from the scene of the robbery, where Hans and Dieter just so happened to also be filling up. Hans then recognised the police chief and stole his gun and his radio from his car, which completely fucked up the police's communications because Hans and Dieter could now listen in on all of the police's frequencies. After spending a while on the road, Hans and Marion went shopping for an hour. And I don't mean going for a good stretch of the legs while stocking up on supplies for the road, I mean shopping. Like, the women kind of shopping. Hans and Marion were just casually strolling through the shops where Marion bought some lovely new clothes with the freshly stolen money. You know, just casually strutting into TK Maxx with 2 hostages in the back of your car. I know that Hans clearly doesn't have all of his dogs barking, but how did he not see that a cross-country police chase with 2 hostages and a lunatic in the backseat might not be the best time to buy your girlfriend a pretty new dress? Meanwhile, the third wheel, Dieter, was left in the car with the hostages. Obviously to do guard duty and keep an eye on the 2 hostages that they had taken with them from the bank. Except, as we have discussed before, Dieter is a fucking moron. At one point, he actually got out of the car for several minutes to go and take a piss and just left the hostages sitting there. And then, when he got back, he fell asleep. He fucking fell asleep in the back of the car. You see, Dieter had spent the entire road trip absolutely strung out on pills and booze. So, he ended up drinking himself to sleep when he should have been watching the hostages. And not only that, but he left his gun lying on the partition between the seats. These guys are absolutely fucking useless. How did the cops not just catch them all immediately? Oh, it's probably because the cops were also completely fucking useless, because they did not assess this situation correctly and they wasted a massive golden opportunity to run in and save the hostages. And unfortunately, the hostages themselves couldn't assess the situation properly either, because they were too terrified to make a run for it despite being completely unattended. This wasn't even the only time that the hostages could have been easily rescued if the cops had just bothered to do their jobs. At another stop during the trip, the robbers went to a cafeteria for something to eat. And they just left the hostages at a different table. They left the hostages unattended again, and the cops still did nothing about it. Eventually, while on the way to Bremen, the robbers got tired of their car, so they decided to ditch it and go out searching for another one to steal. However, they couldn't find any, so instead, they hijacked a bus. So, instead of having just 2 hostages, Hans and Dieter now have 32 hostages. While the cops were having an embarrassingly hard time keeping up with the robbers, the journalists who had been following Hans and Dieter since they started calling the bank were out in droves. They were incessantly reporting on their every movement in real time on live TV and the radio, and the journalists swarmed the bus like flies. Now, while you could say that Dieter was the brains of the operation insofar as the operation was his idea, Hans quickly emerged as the vessel that carried the single brain cell that they shared between them, because he stepped out of the bus and gave a full press conference in the street. He rattled off some demands that he had for the cops, as hostage takers are wont to do, and then he started telling his entire life story to an increasingly captive audience, because some of the audience literally were captives. The journalists were hanging on Hans's every word, because the pseudo-philosophical ravings of this shaggy, unkempt, tattooed and clearly unstable lunatic were absolute gold for the headlines, and they knew it. Hans was spouting such bullshit that he looked like he was about to take a piss on a stoner's rug, going on about how he didn't care if he lived or died, and saying that he would either get away with his rampage scot-free or he would kill himself. And to show the journalists just how serious he was, he put his gun in his own mouth like an edgy boy, and he said, "To be dead is better than to be without money."
Und der letzte ist dann ja.
Hans seemed to really be enjoying this media attention so much that he even let a TV crew onto the bus with his hostages. And I dread to think how the hostages felt in that situation, as legions of journalists are showering these 2 nutcases with attention while doing absolutely fucking nothing to help or save them. Absolutely subhuman wastes of literacy. On the way to Hamburg, the bus stopped at a services in Grünbergsee, where the 2 hostages from the bank were actually released because 2 journalists took their place. I don't think this was done as a sort of self-sacrifice thing to save the hostages. I think it was just so they could have front row seats to get their scoop. The robbers then bought newspapers because they were on the front page and they really enjoyed seeing everything that the media had to say about them. The swarm of journalists that were doing a much better job at following Dieter and Hans, much better than the actual police, meant that the story was being told in real time in print and on the TV and radio. And everyone was watching. This was basically the German equivalent of the O.J. Simpson car chase. Even the robbers themselves were very into the media coverage. Dieter then provided the journalists with some more material by stepping off the bus for a quick chat, keeping his gun held to the throat of an 18-year-old girl named Silke Bischoff, who was a passenger on the bus just heading home with one of her friends. And if you thought that the journalists were shameless before, they then absolutely obliterated the last bit of humanity that you didn't even realise they had. They just walked up to Silky, put a microphone in her face and said to her, "What's it like having a gun held to your throat?" I fucking hate journalists.
Wie geht es Ihnen mit der Pistole am Hals?
Ja, eigentlich ziemlich gut dafür. Mir ist das alles gar nicht so bewusst irgendwie.
At the same time, Marion, Hansi's girlfriend, got off the bus to go to the bathroom, where the cops literally caught her with her pants down. In response, the robbers demanded that the cops give her back immediately or they will kill a hostage every 5 minutes. And believe it or not, for the first time in this entire ordeal, the cops decided to act decisively by immediately going about letting Marion go. However, while they were trying to let her go, the key broke off inside Marion's handcuffs, which delayed her release. And unfortunately, this delay had fatal consequences. While the cops were fumbling to get Marion's handcuffs off, Dieter ran out of patience. And he shot a 14-year-old Italian boy named Emanuele Di Giorgi in the head. Because while a classroom-sized pool of hostages is enough to make the police tread carefully, shooting a young child in the head really sends a message. The journalists managed to get Emanuele off the bus as they noped the fuck out of there, but sadly he ended up bleeding out in the hospital 2 hours later. And since they were just as in control of the situation as ever, the cops immediately went, "Oh fuck," and eventually managed to let Marion go before the hostage takers hurt anyone else. But don't worry, while shit had most certainly gotten real, help was on the way. Throughout the day, the cops were in, well, not exactly hot, but certainly somewhat tepid pursuit, with hundreds of them going after the robbers in cars and helicopters as the bus headed north. But to give you an idea of how well that was going, one cop actually died and another was injured after their car hit a truck during the pursuit. But while the cops could barely keep the robbers in their sights, do you know who managed to stay right hot on their fucking heels? That is right, the fucking journalists. The fuckers went so far to get the scoop that one of them even hired a taxi to chase after the bus. A taxi that ended up getting shot at. At this point, the behaviour of the journalists went beyond heinously distasteful passive observation and became active interference in a hostage situation, which is fucked in and of itself, even by their own excuse for standards. But what made it even more unacceptable in this case was the fact that journalists' actions were now actively putting other people's lives in danger. Later on that night, the bus crossed the border into the Netherlands. The reason they were fleeing to the Netherlands was because Hans had once heard that the police there were a bit nicer. Remember, these guys are morons. Once they arrived, 2 women and 3 children were promptly released because the Dutch cops were refusing to negotiate while there were child hostages. But because Dutch cops seemed to be a lot smarter than the German ones, they gave the robbers a car that had a remote kill switch installed. And all but 2 of the other hostages were released because 30 people couldn't fit inside a BMW. After thoroughly cucking the police once again, Hans drove off, with Marion riding shotgun and Dieter sitting in the back between the bus passengers that drew the short straw. The aforementioned Silke Bischoff and her best friend Ines Voitel, both of whom were 18 years old. Silke was a trainee lawyer who had delayed her commute home from work to actually meet up with her friend Ines after her own workday so that they could ride the bus together and have a chat and hang out. And Unfortunately, Silke went on to be the most famous of the hostages because of the sheer number of infamous pictures of her with Dieter's gun to her throat that were shamelessly circulated around all the papers. At around 7 in the morning on the 18th of August, the carpool from hell crossed the border back into Germany, and they stopped outside of a cafe in Cologne at around 10:30, where the robbers were met by a swarm of their adoring fans. The press. The journalists were all set up and surrounding the car with cameramen clamouring for the perfect shot. One of them even pulled out a stepladder to get a better angle.
Stehen bleiben, ne, sonst knallt. Und hat er auch gemacht. Und da sind wir rein, habe ich gesagt, es passiert kein was hier, verhaltet euch ruhig.
There were so many journalists out for a scoop that they ended up forming a sort of queue to take turns interviewing the robbers and giving them coffee for some fucking reason. One journalist who got an interview with Hans that ultimately never aired described a scene that was pretty surreal, saying that Hans sat in the driver's seat, his windscreen down, and gave interview after interview, like it was a journalistic drive-in. We were all, in some way, culpable. Culpable for what, I hear you ask? Don't worry, we'll get there soon. While Hans was soaking up more than his fair share of attention, poor Silke's day apparently wasn't bad enough because the journalists just kept bothering her. One journalist noticed that Dieter had his gun in his lap. So the fucker actually asked his cameraman, should we have the pistol at our head? You know? Because, being the hostage of a pair of maniacs with blood on their hands is already dangerous enough, but never mind that, let's also add the risk of her getting Alec Baldwin'd during the interview, because it would just make the shot, pop that little bit better, No, I'm not going to Fed post on the main channel. And I'm not even being facetious. There really was an interview like that. Silke had a gun to her throat and the journalists still went in for a soundbite from her. The bastards even had the gall to ask her again, what's it like to have a gun held to your neck?
Wie geht's Ihnen?
Ja, gut. Also, ich habe Angst davor, dass die Polizei nicht darauf eingeht und es dann nochmal so passiert, dass jemand umgebracht wird oder so.
What a great question to ask a terrified 18-year-old girl. Yeah, because that's exactly what you do in a situation like that. Shove a microphone in her face and grill her for a soundbite in literally the worst moment of her life. Pardon me, madam, I realise that you are probably about to die, but I really want to get my bonus this month. By this point, everyone in the car was exhausted and even more on edge than usual, and the high tensions weren't helped by the fact that Dieter was becoming increasingly unstable and, as ever, drunk and off his tits on pills. But you know whose nerves weren't completely shot to shit? Udo Robel's. Robel was the deputy editor of Cologne Daily Express and was having a grand old time unplugged from the media since it was his day off. But then he saw the feeding frenzy on a nearby TV. He smelt the blood in the water and smelt that big fat juicy bonus and dove right into action, saying, I knew I wouldn't have to worry about a headline that day. Because that's the thought that's supposed to appear in your head when you see a young girl having a gun held to her. Yeah, those are the thoughts of a fucking normal person, isn't it? Robel hightailed it to work and wow, what luck, the car was right outside. So Robel got right to work and got a rapport going with the robbers. Despite having gotten himself ingratiated with the robbers, the tensions outside the cafe were only mounting further. No one in the car had slept in days, and it was really starting to show in Hans and Dieter's demeanour, with the former starting to point his gun at the crowd and ask for the quickest route to the Autobahn, because Dieter was on the cusp of fucking losing it. Robel then began to oblige, but he didn't seem to be rattling off the directions fast enough because Hans then impatiently asked Robel to get in the car and point the way for them. At this point, there were a number of thoughts rushing through Robel's head as he was put on the spot, such as, I have been given responsibility for a situation which is becoming less and less controllable. And also, I want this story, this is mine. But the one thought that wasn't going through Robel's head was, maybe I shouldn't get into the car with two armed maniacs at the end of their tether, especially after they've just killed someone. Because Robel got in the car. He just squeezed right in there next to Silky and gave the robbers directions out of the city. So now we have a journalist literally aiding and abetting criminals to help them escape with their hostages because he wants a story.
Schaulustigen glaubt an die Gefahr. Keiner weicht zurück.
During the trip, Robel tried to keep the robbers talking as much as possible, partly in the hope that the car was bugged and he could get the cops some useful information, and also partly in the hope that he could get himself some useful information for his story. But he quickly shut up when he found out that he was only talking to the barrel of Dieter's gun. After about 40 minutes of the most awkward carpool of his life, Robel had fulfilled his promise to get the robbers out of the city, and he was dropped off at a services on the Autobahn, where he immediately started freaking out as the adrenaline wore off and he realised exactly just how much danger he'd put himself in. And it's just as well he got out of the car when he did, because shit was about to hit the fan. As the robbers were driving down the Cologne-Frankfurt Autobahn, the cops ambushed them near Bad Honnef. After 3 days of pussyfooting around the bastards to protect the hostages, the cops finally just said, fuck this, and forced the car off the road by ramming them with several armoured cars like the complete idiots they are. And because the cops finally acted in such a climactic fashion, all hell broke loose, with the volley of stun grenades being heralded by gunshots. Eventually, the exchange of gunfire ended with the arrest of a seriously injured Hans and Dieter. Ines Voitel was also seriously injured, but fortunately she managed to get herself to relative safety by hiding in a nearby ditch while all of the shit was going down. But sadly, Silke Bischoff wasn't so lucky. She had been shot in the heart and died at the scene. It isn't entirely clear who actually fired the fatal shot, but the general consensus is that it was most likely Hans, although he maintains that it was actually the cops who shot her. But just like that, it was over. After 54 hours and 430 miles, the worst road trip of all time was finally over, at the cost of the lives of 2 innocent hostages. After the dust settled, the courts got to work on cleaning up after the robbers. On the 22nd of March 1991, Hans and Dieter were both sentenced to life in prison, with Marion getting 9 years. She was then released after 6 years for good behaviour and hasn't drawn any attention to herself ever since. In 2013, Dieter started to go on trips outside of prison with varying levels of supervision until he was eventually released in February of 2018 after he was deemed to have been rehabilitated. He was given a new identity and reportedly lives on unemployment benefits and passes the time with volunteer work, much to the chagrin of Emmanuel's brother, who said, "He is free while we'll suffer for a lifetime. I often dream of him. He's sitting on the bus, then the shot comes, and I wake up." And I have to say, I agree with him. Just shy of 30 years isn't long enough for someone who literally blew a child's brains out. Like, just literally shot a 14-year-old boy in the head to make a point to the police. Look, I'm sorry, if you do that and then you get 2 other people killed in the wake of an armed robbery you just done, I don't care how mentally ill you are or how rehabilitated you've become. You should never see the light of day again. As you would expect, Emmanuel's brother wasn't the only family member affected by what happened. Decades later, Emmanuel's sister, who was actually sitting right next to him on the bus when everything went down, continued to have a visceral reaction to being touched on the temple as a result of having a gun put to her head so many times. And then there is Silky Bischoff's mother, who was obviously also seriously affected by the hostage crisis, especially considering the awful images plastered all over the media of her daughter with a gun to her neck. But as the years passed, she managed to heal enough to laud her daughter's courage, reflecting with, "Silke was very brave. Very brave. I wouldn't have coped in the way she did. At the beginning, I used to have nightmares because of that picture. I can handle it today. It's still painful, but I don't have to look away now." And she really was incredibly brave. I can't imagine how scary a situation like that would be for anyone, and the fact that she managed to stay so calm while staring down both the barrel of a gun and a horde of journalists looking for nothing more than to make a spectacle of her is incredible. I can't state enough just how much of a tragic waste it is that she never made it out of there. But where is Silky's killer now? Well, you'll be glad to hear that Hans is still in prison. He is open about his regret for what he did, although he has no intention of apologising because he doesn't feel like it would be enough. As he put it himself, "I keep my feelings towards the victims and their families to myself, because there is no point in revealing it. It goes without saying that I deeply regret the act. After all, people lost their lives in the process." So, as far as the perpetrators were concerned, justice was done. About as well as one can expect from the state. Not great, not terrible. But that doesn't mean that everyone who was at fault was held accountable. But while no one really watches The Watchmen, the public reaction to the actions of the police was far from positive, with the cops being widely blamed for letting Silke and Emmanuel die, because, well, it pretty much is their fault, but many people believed that the robbers weren't stopped quickly enough, including politicians, with a Conservative MP saying they should have acted more decisively, even if this would have meant risking the death of the hostages. Now, while I see where he was coming from, I think that going "fuck them kids" and blowing the robbers to hell, hostages be damned, is a little bit too gung-ho. After all, look at what happens when trigger-happy American cops try to save hostages. However, in this case, the cops absolutely should have acted quicker and more decisively, because their complete inaction left blood on their hands. You know how Emmanuel bled out after being shot in the head? Well, an investigation revealed that even before that point, the cops could have overpowered the robbers at least 3 times, including the 2 occasions that we discussed earlier. But wait, it gets worse. After Emmanuel was shot, the ambulance took half an hour to get to the scene, which is bad enough, but that's not the cops' fault. But what was the cops' fault was the fact that once it arrived, the ambulance was held up for a further 20 minutes because the cops had closed the road and they wouldn't let it through. Even though they knew that someone just down the road had just been shot in the head, they wouldn't let the ambulance through. They kept it there for 20 minutes. And you want to know what was discovered in the aftermath? During those 20 minutes, if the ambulance was able to get in when it arrived, Emmanuel could have been saved. He would have lived. But nope, the cops just had to give the robbers complete control of the situation and let Emmanuel bleed to death. They let a child bleed to death because they chose to just sit back, watch the carnage and see what happened instead of pulling their fingers out of their arse and doing their jobs. The police consciously did not allow this ambulance to come through even though they knew a child had been shot in the head. The police consciously allowed a teenage boy to die. Not everyone agreed, however. Herbert Schnur, the Interior Minister of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, defended the cops, saying that they acted appropriately in the chase's climax despite the tragic resolution, because the robbers were so unpredictable that they had to be stopped quickly. But despite praising the cops' haste in that critical moment on the autobahn, he was heavily criticised for just sitting on his thumbs and not actually doing anything. Especially when the two bank employees were absolutely ripe for the rescuing while the robbers were at the shops or literally sleeping on the job. He was also rightfully lambasted by Conservatives for not sending in the federal anti-terrorist unit after shit really started to get real. But you know how he defended himself? He said that he had a justified hope that the hostages were about to be released and therefore risky intervention wouldn't have been necessary. Yeah, that's right. The guy looked at this situation and thought to himself, yeah, I'm sure that these homicidal maniacs that literally just blew a child's brain out on a bus in front of dozens and dozens of people will probably get bored and just let the hostages go soon. Relax, everyone, everything's fine. Like a true politician, Schnur ultimately refused to take any responsibility for his actions, or lack thereof, by accusing the journalists of completely hamstringing the cops' efforts to save the hostages. Now look, a lot of what went down was absolutely Schnur's fault. But he is right. The journalists absolutely fucked the cops over. Although, if he didn't want journalists getting involved, then maybe he should have done something first. You can't take a shit in the street and expect the flies to leave it alone. If there is anything about the response to this travesty where there's almost a unanimous consensus, it's the fact that the conduct of the journalists covering all of this was absolutely fucking appalling, with the hostage crisis being called the darkest hour of German journalism since the end of World War II by the head of Germany's biggest journalists' union. The way the journalists stirred the pot and in some cases literally aided and abetted the criminals was condemned by both sides of the political aisle, with a Liberal Free Democratic Member of Parliament saying, "Two criminals got a public podium through media coverage," and a Conservative saying, "It is unbearable that gangsters are able to parade themselves on television. The public should be informed, but not at the cost of the hostages or police." Adding insult to injury, it is also likely that the media circus actually made the robbers' actions even worse. A media psychologist named Joe Gorable said that by satisfying their desire for attention, the journalists effectively compelled the criminals to go even further. Like, they saw this as an opportunity to become legends, and they took it. People are more likely to do more extreme and outlandish things if they have a captive audience. You know, same as the bully that takes it a little bit too far when his friends are watching. That type of thing. At one point, during the interviews, one of the robbers even said, "From here on, I only want to speak through the media." Now, I know that the police negotiators were pretty useless, but they should have been the ones to try and talk these guys down. Not the baying journalists who literally trade in shock and horror, because it's in their best interests to keep the shock and horror going. But amidst all of this condemnation, the most shocking twist of them all was the fact that the one journalist who stuck his nose in further than any other had a conscience. A journalist, feeling remorse and taking responsibility for his actions. I know, I couldn't believe it either. Despite the fact that his career turned out completely fine because he went on to become the editor-in-chief of Germany's most popular tabloid, Udo Robel felt really bad about what he did on the last day of the hostage crisis. Summing up the actions of himself and his peers, he said, "Journalistically, we totally messed up." You don't fucking say. Robel ended up taking a lot of very harsh criticism in the wake of the media scandal, to the point of being accused of being complicit because he helped give the robbers directions. As the report from the parliamentary inquiry scathingly put it, the chances seem slim in the foreseeable future that there will be a change of awareness when it is accepted that, for example, the journalist who actively helps the perpetrators and who makes the job of the police significantly harder is then recruited by a rival newspaper on better remuneration with clear reference to his clever behaviour. And you would be right. We're now about 30-40 years later, and journalism hasn't changed much. Regardless of Robel's motivations, it's really hard to argue with that assessment. Though, it didn't stop Robel from trying. He grappled with the allegations of complicity for years, and he tried to rationalise his actions as well as he could. However, he had to admit that while he wanted to try and de-escalate the situation and help Silke and Ines, I have no idea how these names are pronounced. Sorry, don't speak German, and don't care to. Robel couldn't deny that in large part his motivations were selfish, and that he was a major part of the problem. This weighed very heavily on his conscience, and he was ashamed that he, in his own words, squeezed the very last drops out of the story. While it's satisfying to know that Robel stewed in his shame for a good few years, he did eventually receive what was described as absolution when the judge gave some words of support at a public discussion at a local police academy, where he said, "It seems to me, Herr Robel, that you prevented a bloodbath that day in Cologne. If you hadn't got into the car and the gangsters wouldn't have been able to drive away, the whole situation would have run out of control." I know that I've shat on journalists a lot throughout this video, but I can't quite bring myself to dismiss that point entirely. I can almost dismiss that point, and I would like to, but I can't. However, it doesn't excuse the absolute cascade of bullshit dropped on the situation by the police and journalists alike that brought Robel to that point. And it's not as if his motivations were particularly pure either. At the end of the day, the situation was a complete disgrace, and while you can argue that Robel's role was sort of anti-heroic, there's no excuse for the legions of other journalists that willfully encouraged the robbers, hamstrung the cops, made fortunes for their editors, and got 2 teenagers killed. In the end, after much debate over who was in the wrong and the how and the why, the German Press Council banned journalists from interviewing people who are involved in active hostage situations. So that's a rule that they had to make. You know, I would just sort of assume that that's something that you shouldn't do in a situation like that, but hey-ho, apparently these guys had to be reminded and had to have a set rule put in place to prevent them from doing that. So, overall, the consequences of the journalists' actions amounted to a stern telling off and a "don't you do that again." Not even a fucking slap in the wrist, they pretty much completely got away with it. I don't know, man. Maybe Orwell was wrong about journalists. I don't really know what to say at this point. Despite the wacky antics of Hans and Dieter, this story just ended up being really depressing. It kind of reminds me of the media circus around Raoul Moat that was just fucking weird. But even then, the journalists didn't cross the line like they did during those few days in Gladbeck. It's almost as if Nightcrawler was a documentary.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody subscribe.